Hi, my name is Amanda Brown of Fabric Heart, and I'm really excited to share today's project with you. It uses one of my favorite OLFA tools, the chenille cutter. When I first met the chenille cutter, I was not convinced that it was a tool that I was going to fall in love with. In fact, I was pretty sure I was going to hate it. I challenged myself to try it out. I used the chenille cutter in ways that I didn't think it could be used. And now I'm going to do something that I think most people start with, which is a chenille blanket. So I made myself a spooky Halloween chenilled blanket. Join me today while we make this beautiful chenille blanket together. I've used some spooky ghosts, but you can use whatever fabrics you want. Let's talk about all the tools that we're going to need to make the chenille blanket. Of course, how could we not talk about right away the OLFA chenille cutter? We're also going to want a rotary cutter. I'm going to use this 45mm Ergo handle and a ruler and a cutting mat. The lengths on this require some long cuts, and I like to match the ruler to the size of the project. So I'm going to be using this. I'm going to be using my favorite marker, which is a Hera marker. Any fabric marking tool that you love will work here. And then also I'm going to use quilter's pins. Other pins will work as well. Just something to hold all the layers together. These ones are curved. They're specifically made for quilting. So those are the tools that we're going to use besides a sewing machine. If you have a walking foot on your sewing machine, that would be ideal. If not, you can get by without it, but those are the main tools. The blanket that I'm making is 42 inches by 45 inches. I'm using flannel. You can also use woven cotton that isn't stretchy. I like to use something with a looser weave so that when it chenilles, it frays better. So I like using flannel. Found these adorable ghosts. You're going to need a minimum of 5 layers. So you want at least 1 backing layer and then 4 layers to chenille, and then you could have fun and add a couple more extra layers. This is what I'm using for fabrics. For the back, I'm actually going to use 2 layers of these ghosts. I'll talk about that later. And for the bottom layer, so those ones, we want it slightly bigger than top. So I'm using 1 1/3 yards of fabric for both of those. So I need 2 2/3 basically of that. And then for the layers that I'm going to chenille, I have more ghosts because more is fun. A white layer, a dark pink layer, a light pink layer, and then this orangey layer. You can do whatever you want. You could use all the same fabric. I've seen that done a lot. Or you could just use one solid color. Or the sky's the limit here. Have fun picking out your fabrics and what you want to use. You're going to need 1 1/4 meters of each of those, and we're going to cut those down slightly so that they're not quite as wide. And the last fabric that you're going to need is something for your binding around the edge. I'm using this pink, it's like a corally, really soft pink satin. You could use just a regular cotton or a flannel to do your binding, but I love this kind of satiny on the edge of the chenille blankets. I encourage you to make some test swatches, test little blankets before you get started so you get exactly what you're hoping for. I didn't know how I wanted to lay out all of my different fabrics. I did know that I wanted a certain look, and so I decided to go ahead and make some little test swatches. And I love this idea. And these really are going to make the perfect little doll blankets. The first one I went with the yellow on the top, and then I went with different colors of pink down to the white. And in the background here, on the very bottom layer, it's hard to see here, but I actually have ghosts on the bottom there too. And when you get to see it in a certain direction, you can see the ghosts still underneath here. I tried it without the ghosts, with just the backing fabric coming through. And what I use, I'm using a black fabric here, which is also spooky Halloween, but I probably wouldn't have used a dark fabric like this. I used a different fabric on the back for these tests because I didn't want to waste those ghosts. What I noticed when I made these two, because they're basically the same thing, one has 2 layers of the backing fabric and this one only has 1 layer. and I really liked how it felt with 2 backing layers of fabric. I find this just a little too flimsy for my liking, so this comparison taught me right here, instead of using all the fabric, that I definitely want to have 2 layers of my backing fabric. But I definitely didn't want this flimsy, so I'm going to throw that one out. Next, I decided to reverse the ombre and go in with 2 different options. And here, this here is when you go awry while you're chenilling. I like to keep things like this in here because it's a good lesson to me to remember to take my time. So this one, I just have white and then into my pinks and my yellows with the ghosts in the background. And I really liked how this looked. I put the ghost fabric on top of here as well. And so then you can sort of get the feel of what you can see with the ghosts on top as well. So and this one I didn't put the second layer of ghosts in here. I used it on top instead. So I looked through all my options and I decided to kind of go with a hybrid of these. I'm going to use my ghosts on top. I'm going to reverse the ombre so that I have yellow last. I kind of like the depth it creates with that. And then I'm going to put ghosts on the back there and ghosts here. So I'm going to have 2 layers of the ghosts.
To prep the layers that we're going to chenille, we're going to cut them down by 1 inch on either side parallel to the selvage. So that's what I'm doing here, just 1 inch off either side. So instead of being 44 inches wide, it is now 42.
I work in a really tiny studio. While I'm making my big full-size one, I'm going to make this tiny little chenille blanket for you so that you can see the whole thing as I'm working on it and I don't have to get super creative with my camera. I'm going to take a picture so you can see the setup at the moment. That's the setup I'm working with. And so trying to get a full blanket in this frame is not going to happen in here. So I'm making a mini one at the same time. I'll show you pictures of the large one as it goes along. But here is how I'm assembling this. When you're working with the full one, we're looking at 1 1/3 yards of your backing fabric. And you want to take that full size width of fabric. I don't even remove the selvages at this point because they give you a little extra to grip onto. So I have 2 layers of ghosts here with wrong sides facing so that I can see it like this. I'm going to lay that down flat. And next we're going to start to layer our solid flannels. Is to lay this in the middle so that I have space all around it to hold on while I'm chenilling. It also prevents me from cutting through all the layers. You don't want to do that because then it would fall apart. And then I'm going to start adding in each color that's a little bit lighter. So I have a dark pink and then I have a light pink. So then I have the white one and then I'm finishing it off with the ghosts on top. When it comes to quilting, sometimes we like to baste with a spray baste. We can't do this because we don't want them sticking together once we finish sewing them together. So this is where the pins come in handy. We're just going to go through all the layers and kind of keep everything nice and smooth. So I'm going to start, I kind of started in the middle line here, and then I'm going to work my way out. And this is a small example. I'm going to put them closer together, but a hand width apart is more than enough while you're doing this.
This is my big version all laid out and I have it pinned. I am not using a ton of pins here, just a few because the flannel kind of sticks together. But if you're using something slipperier, definitely pin more than this.
Let's talk about how we're going to set up our chenille cutter. For these ones here, I have used the largest guide that's on there, which is a double L. And you can tell from the lines on the back, I sewed these at 1/2 inch apart. And that is the suggested width when you're using the extra large double L guide. And on these, you can see there's a double L there. Then we have a small over here. And this is a medium one. And this is the large. And each of these, it's this width here that determines how far apart you sew each of your lines. So I like to use the double L, and that means I need to sew my lines 1/2 inch apart. If you were using the medium, you would only have to sew them about 1/4 inch apart. And even smaller for the small, and kind of 3/8 in between the two.
This is kind of personal preference, but for a blanket, I really feel like having them 1/2 inch apart is ideal, but you do you.
So I'm going to use my double L guide, and I'm going to stitch my rows 1/2 inch apart. When we're chenilling, we get the best results when we sew lines on a 45 on the bias. I'm going to mark this from corner to corner as our starting point. If you are doing this, because this is teeny tiny, so it's pretty straightforward, when I'm doing this on a large piece of fabric, I often use the lines on my ruler here. So I will look at a straight line here, and when I line that edge up, and I have this edge up here, I know from here to here, that's 45 degrees. So that I can mark that point here, and then I can make this line. And then when I need to make more lines, but they're further apart, I can use this line as a guide, but also check in with my 45 degree line here and mark it further on. So I've made the corner here. I could mark out every 1/2 inch, but that's a lot. I'm putting my next line 1 inch apart because then I can tell with the side of my foot and making sure my needle's in the right position where my next line will be in between those two.
I tend to over mark at the beginning, so I'm drawing 3 lines on here, but once I get it going, I mark a lot less. So don't feel like you need to come back every time. If it's going straight, just keep going. When I move on to my big blanket, I don't have a ruler that will get me all the way across, so I'm just going to use the 45 degree line on my big ruler here and line that up along the bottom edge, and then that long edge is going to be on a 45 degree angle, and I will slowly make my way across the blanket, marking that line.
When we get to the other edge, I'm going to use this other 45 degree line to check to see how my line is doing. And it's doing pretty good. I have my lines started on here, so it's time for me to start to sew my diagonal lines. I'm going to use my walking foot, and I'm also going to shorten my stitch length to 1.8. And I just like to do that to make sure that my stitches are really nice and secure, so I'm not losing any chenille at the end of this quilt. I'm a couple passes in, so now I'm going to recheck my line and draw another guide a little further out just to make sure that I stay on path. I have all my lines stitched on here. Doesn't that look cute? I'm very excited by that. And now it's time to chenille. When you are using this chenille cutter, this turns one way and the other way. So how do you know which way? Well, the red up here says to select the guide, we're going to turn it this way. And to know which guide is open, you look to see these little arrows here, but you get to see where the blade's open. Here it's guarded, so you can't use it there or there. And if you wanted to select one, you would just keep turning it until you select, until it is at the guide that you want. So I'm going to put it right here. And then to make sure that you're cutting nice and sharply each time, you can select your edge and change it. There are 24 different edges, and if I turn it clockwise, then one click gives me a new edge every time. And there's a handy dandy scale on here that lets you know if when you put a new blade in, if you turn it so that it's at your little arrow here, is where it's metal here, you can see through, is pointing at the 0. So you know you're at the starting point, and every time you need a new edge, you click it 1, and now you have a new edge. And when you turn your guard, it is actually turning the blade with you, so you're carrying that same edge point all the way around. So you don't have to worry about keeping track. Now that you switch to a different guide, you don't have to keep track of that. It moves with it. This is the fun part. Okay, I'm going to select my double L guide. So I have my double L guide selected. You can see the metal there. I have my blade at the first position. And now all I have to do is put the tip of my guide under all those layers of fabric. And I'm going to hold back here. And I'm going to try to keep this flat, straight on the ground, on the table, so that my guide is going between those two stitch lines nice and even. And I'm going to gently pull or push to the other end. So I'm pulling with this hand, I'm pushing with that one. So the next one, make sure you've got all the layers there. And you're going to go through nice and gently. When you're dealing with a large piece, you're going to want to stop and adjust every once in a while, because if you go off the rails, this is what happens when you go off the rails. What happened here was I wasn't paying attention and I cut this one too close to this edge because I let it tilt up as I was cutting and go crazy. So when you're cutting, make sure that everything's nice and flat and you're taking your time, because this isn't pretty. This is gorgeous. To deal with clogs, because sometimes that does happen, what I like to do, instead of going first for a new edge on the blade, I move this guide all the way around and remove some of those threads. And it actually usually is just because there's a lot of thread that gets caught in there because of what we're doing. So I clear the guard so that it's nice and clear again. I still am using the same edge, and I will find that it cuts well again.
This is faster than you'll ever chenille in your life, but it's fun. I'm moving on to the big blanket here, and I'm doing the same thing, but you'll notice that I'm only doing a portion of it at a time. I will then go back, adjust, and do the other part of the blanket. This just makes sure that I'm able to keep the blanket flat as I'm chenilling each section. Here I'm clearing out a bigger clog. I am trying to switch it to the next guide, and then I will keep moving it around and trying to clear that out. By the time I get around all the way to the guide that I need again, I find I'm able to get all those threads out without a problem. It's a little linty.
But we won't see the magic of the chenilling until after we kind of wash it the first time. It's time to square this up. But I'm going to trim off the excess that we had left to make it easier to pull, because we don't necessarily want that in with our binding. But if you are so inclined, you could do the self-binding, where you just fold the backing up over the top and then it's bound for you. You just stitch it down. That's up to you.
If you found that your layers have shifted while you're stitching, this is the point where you would trim off a little extra just to make everything look nice and even from the top. Don't worry too much if some of your layers aren't there. It's going to be fuzzy and cozy and you won't be able to tell. Now I'm going to do that with my big one, and my big one did shift more than the small one. It's physics and science and stuff, trust me. And here I'll just trim off the little extras so everything's nice and even. No one's gonna know. I'm going to give you a quick overview of how I bind this. If you have your own preferred method, please go ahead and use that. One thing to mention is I'm cutting my binding strips at 4 inches. I normally do 2.5 inches. There is a lot more bulk in your binding, so be generous with it. I am cutting 4 4-inch strips of my satin for my binding. I'm going to join these on the bias, so I'm going to lay them with right sides together perpendicular like this and sew on the diagonal. Once they are sewn together, I'm going to cut off the excess 1/4 inch away from that sew-in line, so when I open it, it lays flat. It's like magic. And now that I've cut that excess away, I can open it up and give it a little press. Use like a medium heat iron if you're working with satin. After it is one giant strip, I'm going to fold it in half, hot dog style, and I'm going to give it a press. But you'll notice here I'm picking up the iron and pressing it down because satin will stretch. I'm sewing the raw edge down on my blanket 1/2 inch from the edge. When you get to the corner, it's a little bit tricky. I sew a 1/2 inch from the edge of the corner. I lift my foot and I do a little reverse there just to tie things in. And then I'm going to fold my strip up one way on a 45, and then I'm going to fold it back down the opposite way, and that is going to make my mitered corner from the front. And then I'm just going to turn the blanket and continue stitching down the next side to the next corner. When you go all the way around and you're back at the beginning, you're going to join those ends together, and then you're going to fold the binding all the way over to the front and then attach it to the front of your blanket. And now you're done. Well, almost. You need to wash and dry your blanket. Make sure to clean out the lint trap in your dryer after washing and drying this, because it sure is linty, and then it'll be nice and cuddly and fluffy for you.
It's all done. It's washed. It's fluffed. It's chenilled. It's all yours. Thank you for joining me today as we used OLFA chenille cutter to make a chenille blanket. The part that I loved the most about this blanket was sewing all those straight lines. No, I'm joking. What I loved most was cutting all the lines. That was a lot of fun. I hope you've enjoyed this, and until I see you again, happy sewing.